While our attorney continued trying to identify the owner of the unfamiliar bank account connected to the foundation records, I made a decision that had nothing to do with legal files or investigations. I wanted one ordinary morning. Just one. For months, my life had revolved around documents, insurance records, bank statements, storage units, letters, timelines. Every week seemed to uncover another question I never expected to ask. I missed something much simpler. Conversation. Laughter. The comfort of seeing familiar faces without wondering what surprise might be waiting around the next corner. That was why, after several months away, I decided to return to my neighborhood community gathering. For years, it had been one of my favorite parts of the month. People brought homemade desserts. Neighbors shared stories. Someone always remembered a birthday. Someone always needed volunteers for the next charity event. It wasn't anything extraordinary. It was simply a place where people cared about one another. I woke up early that morning. For the first time in weeks, I chose my clothes without thinking about attorney meetings or paperwork. Instead, I picked a light blue sweater Thomas had always liked. He used to smile whenever I wore it. "It reminds me of spring," he would say. As I looked in the mirror before leaving the house, I realized something. I looked tired. Not physically. Emotionally. Months of unanswered questions have a way of changing a person's face. Still, I smiled at my reflection. Today wasn't about investigations. Today was about returning to normal life. At least, that was what I believed. The community center looked exactly as I remembered. Cars filled the parking lot. Fresh coffee greeted people near the entrance. The familiar sound of conversation floated through the hallway. For a brief moment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Relief. Maybe this morning would simply be ordinary. I opened the front door and stepped inside. Almost immediately, someone called my name. "Margaret!" I turned and saw an old acquaintance walking toward me with a warm smile. We had known each other for years. We had volunteered together at holiday food drives, shared church dinners, celebrated birthdays. She reached me quickly and took both of my hands. Her smile was gentle, sympathetic, almost as though she were greeting someone who had survived a terrible illness. "Margaret!" She squeezed my hand softly. "It's so good to see you. You look much better." I smiled politely. "Thank you." Then she said something I never expected to hear. "I'm so glad you're feeling better after your recovery." I frowned slightly. "My recovery?" She nodded with genuine kindness. "After the treatment." I stared at her. "What treatment?" She looked surprised. "The medication." I felt my heartbeat quicken. "I'm sorry. I don't understand." She lowered her voice. "I didn't want to embarrass you." "There isn't anything to be embarrassed about," I answered honestly. "What are you talking about?" She hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Everyone said you had been receiving treatment for an addiction to prescription pain medication." For a moment, I honestly wondered whether I had misunderstood her. The words sounded impossible. "Addiction?" I repeated. She nodded again. "We've all been hoping you were doing better." I couldn't answer. Not because I didn't know what to say. Because I couldn't understand what I was hearing. "I've never been addicted to pain medication." The sentence came out almost automatically. "I've never attended any treatment program." Her expression changed immediately. Confusion replaced certainty. She paused. "I thought." Her voice slowly faded. Neither of us knew what to say next. Around us, other conversations continued. Coffee was poured. People laughed. Chairs scraped gently across the floor. The world kept moving. Yet I stood completely still. Then I noticed something else. Several people nearby had quietly looked in our direction. Not with curiosity. With recognition. The kind of recognition people show when they believe they already know part of someone else's story. One woman offered me a gentle smile. Another gave a small encouraging nod. A gentleman across the room raised his hand and called out, "It's good to see you back, Margaret. Keep taking care of yourself." There was kindness in every voice. Compassion. Concern. No one sounded judgmental. That almost made it harder. Because they weren't trying to hurt me. They genuinely believed something had happened. I slowly realized this wasn't one person's misunderstanding. This wasn't a rumor shared by only a single neighbor. The expressions around the room told me something much larger. Many people seemed to believe the same story. A story I had never lived. A story I had never told. A story that somehow carried my name. I quietly thanked the woman for speaking with me and found an empty chair near the back of the room. I sat down, but I couldn't focus on the meeting. The conversations around me became distant. My thoughts returned again and again to one question. How many people believed this? More importantly, where had they heard it? When the meeting ended, several friends stopped to greet me. Every conversation felt just a little different now. A little more careful. A little more sympathetic. No one mentioned addiction directly again. But I noticed something in their voices. The way they asked whether I was doing better. The way they smiled with quiet relief. The way they seemed grateful to see me there. By the time I walked back to my car, I no longer doubted what had happened. This was no longer a rumor carried by one person's misunderstanding. Somewhere along the way, a story about my life had spread through people I had trusted. And judging by the faces I had seen that morning, it had become something many of them accepted as true. As I started the engine and reached for my phone to call Daniel, one thought stayed with me. The investigation had already uncovered missing documents. Missing memories. Missing decisions. Now it seemed we were facing something even more personal. Somehow, a life I had never lived had begun replacing the one I actually had. And I needed to know who had been telling that story. After that first conversation at the community center, I thought about quietly leaving. Part of me wanted to walk back to my car, drive home, close the front door, and pretend the morning had never happened. But another part of me knew that if I left without asking questions, I would spend the next several weeks wondering, who believed it? How many people had heard the story? Where had it begun? Over the past year, I had learned something important. Questions don't disappear simply because we avoid them. So instead of going home, I stayed. I poured myself a cup of coffee and joined a small group of women I had known for years. We had celebrated birthdays together, cooked meals after funerals, organized holiday events. These weren't strangers. They were people who had been part of my life for a very long time. The conversation began normally. We talked about grandchildren, the weather, the church picnic planned for the summer. Then one woman gently touched my arm. "Margaret, I'm really glad you're feeling better." I smiled politely. "Thank you." Then I decided to ask, "May I ask you something?" "Of course. When you say you're glad I'm feeling better, what have you heard?" The women looked at one another. Not nervously. More as though they were deciding who should answer first. Finally, one of them spoke. "I heard you'd been receiving treatment for quite a while." She sounded sincere. Not dramatic. Simply convinced that she was repeating something true. I quietly asked, "What kind of treatment?" She lowered her voice. "For prescription pain medication." I gently shook my head. "I've never received treatment for that." Her eyes widened. "Really?" "No." She looked genuinely surprised. "I thought that's why you hadn't been coming." Another woman spoke up. "I heard something similar." She leaned forward slightly. "I was told you needed a long recovery." I looked at her. "Who told you that?" She frowned thoughtfully. "I honestly can't remember. I just remember hearing it months ago." Months ago. The words sounded painfully familiar. That was exactly how other misunderstandings had spread. Not through one dramatic conversation, but through time. People hearing something, then repeating it, until no one remembered where it had started. A few minutes later, Another longtime friend joined our table. Someone quietly asked her, "Did you hear Margaret's doing much better now?" She smiled warmly at me. "I really am happy to see you." Then, she added, "I heard Daniel had been helping you with almost everything." I blinked. "What do you mean?" She answered without hesitation. "I thought he was taking care of your daily life. I heard you weren't really able to manage things on your own anymore." I stared at her. Again. There was no judgment in her voice. Only concern. She honestly believed she was describing my recent life. I gently replied, "Daniel has helped me with many things. Especially lately. But not because I lost the ability to care for myself." She looked confused. I thought. Her sentence faded before she finished it. By then, I recognized the pattern. Different people. Different conversations. Different details. Yet somehow, the same story. Later that morning, I spoke with another acquaintance near the refreshment table. Without realizing what had already happened that day, she smiled and said, "I suppose you're happy to be back after everything." I asked the same question again. "What have you heard?" She answered kindly. "I was told you stepped away from community activities because you were focusing on your health." "What kind of health?" She hesitated. I assumed. Then she stopped. I guess I never really asked? Neither had most of the people I spoke with that morning. Some believed I had spent months in treatment. Others believed I had quietly withdrawn from public life. A few thought my absence explained why Daniel had become more involved in helping me. Each version sounded a little different. But they all pointed in the same direction. Something serious had happened to Margaret. Something everyone else already seemed to know. Except me. By lunchtime, I had spoken with nearly a dozen people. None of them sounded cruel. None of them seemed eager to spread gossip. Quite the opposite. Most spoke with kindness, compassion, gentleness. That was what made the experience so painful. These were not people trying to damage my reputation. They believed they were showing concern for someone who had gone through a difficult season. As I drove home later that afternoon, I thought about every conversation. Not one person had claimed to witness anything firsthand. Not one person described seeing me in treatment. Not one person told me they had spoken directly with me. Each conversation began almost the same way. "I heard. Someone told me. I thought. I was under the impression." The details changed. The certainty remained. When I arrived home, Daniel was already waiting in the driveway. He could tell immediately that something had happened. "How did it go?" I sat beside him at the kitchen table before answering. "I spent the morning talking to people." "What did they say?" I slowly told him everything. One conversation after another. The treatment program. The recovery. The concern. The belief that he had taken over caring for me because I could no longer manage my own life. Daniel listened without interrupting. When I finished, he remained quiet for a long time. Finally, he asked, "Did anyone say they heard it directly from you?" I shook my head. "No." "Did anyone say they personally saw any of it happen?" Again. "No." He looked down at the notebook in front of him. Then quietly wrote a single sentence. Different stories. Same conclusion. He underlined it once. Not because it explained everything. Because it described exactly what we had discovered. The people I spoke with that morning were not trying to hurt me. Most of them had known me for years. They had celebrated birthdays with my family. Prayed with me. Volunteered beside me. They cared about me. The problem wasn't that they wanted to believe something bad about me. The problem was much simpler. They believed they were repeating the truth. As I looked out the kitchen window that evening, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. A false story doesn't have to be repeated with cruelty to cause real harm. Sometimes it travels through kindness. Through sympathy. Through sincere concern. People repeat it because they believe they are caring for someone, not realizing that every repetition carries the story a little farther from the truth. And somehow, That was exactly what had happened to me. After I told Daniel what people in the community had been saying, neither of us wanted to rely on memory or emotion. We had learned better than that. The next morning, Daniel drove me to see my family doctor. I had known him for years. He had treated me through ordinary illnesses, blood pressure checkups, annual exams, and one surgery I had undergone long before Thomas passed away. When we sat in the examination room, I explained why we were there. "I need a summary of my medical history," I said. "Especially anything related to pain medication." The doctor looked concerned, but he did not interrupt. When I finished, he nodded and opened my chart. For several minutes, he reviewed the records quietly. Then he printed a treatment summary and placed it in front of me. Daniel leaned closer. Together, we read every line. There it was. Years earlier, after a minor surgery, I had been prescribed pain medication for a short period. The dosage was listed clearly. The start date. The end date. The follow-up appointment. The doctor's note said the medication had been used as directed. No concerns documented. No refill pattern. No warning signs. No diagnosis related to addiction. No treatment program. No rehabilitation record. Nothing. I looked at Daniel. He was still reading. Slowly. Carefully. As if he wanted to make sure he didn't miss even one word. The doctor spoke gently. "Mrs. Anderson, based on the records I have here, there is no indication that you were treated for prescription medication abuse." I closed my eyes for a moment. Not because I was surprised. Because hearing it clearly from the medical record gave me something I had needed. Confirmation. Daniel turned another page. Then another. Finally, he placed the papers flat on the table. His voice was quiet. "The records don't match what people are saying." I looked at him. "No," I said. "They don't?" The doctor offered to print an official summary for my personal records. I accepted. Not because I wanted to carry it around and defend myself to everyone, but because I had learned that truth should be preserved before it is needed. As we left the clinic, Daniel held the folder in both hands. He looked troubled. Not because the medical record raised new doubts. Because it removed them. The story spreading through the community had made me sound unstable. Dependent. Unable to manage my own life. But the actual medical record showed something simple and ordinary. A short prescription. Used properly. No addiction. No treatment. No hidden history. In the parking lot, Daniel stopped beside the truck. "For months," he said, "people have been reacting to a version of you that doesn't exist." I smiled sadly. "That is what rumors do." He looked at the clinic folder again. This time, his face carried no confusion. Only the weight of understanding. The medical record had not explained where the rumor began. But it had answered one important question. The story people were repeating was not the story my life had actually lived. A few days after we received the medical summary, Daniel and I stopped by the community center again. I did not want to hide. For too long, rumors had moved through rooms where I was not present. This time, I wanted to stand there with the truth in my hands. We had only been there a few minutes when an old friend of Daniel's walked over. At first, the conversation was ordinary. Work. Family. The weather. Then the man lowered his voice and said, "I'm glad your mom is doing better after everything." Daniel looked at him calmly. "What do you mean?" The man hesitated. "You know, the pain medication issue." The room seemed to go quiet around me. I stood a few steps away, close enough to hear. For a moment, I wondered what Daniel would do. In the past, he might have stayed silent. He might have changed the subject. He might have assumed the other person meant well and let the comment pass. But this time, he didn't. He kept his voice steady. "I've reviewed my mother's medical records." The man blinked. Daniel continued. "What you heard doesn't match what is documented in those records." He did not sound angry. He did not embarrass the man. He did not raise his voice. He simply stated the truth. My mother was prescribed pain medication for a short time after surgery years ago. It was used as directed. There is no record of addiction treatment. The man's expression changed. I'm sorry. I didn't know. Daniel nodded. I understand. Then he added, That's why we need to be careful repeating things we haven't verified. The man looked genuinely ashamed. I didn't mean any harm. I know, Daniel said. But harm can still happen. I stood there, unable to speak. Not because the moment was dramatic. Because it was simple. And because I had waited so long for something that simple. My son had not defended me by attacking anyone. He had not turned the conversation into a fight. He had not demanded that people choose sides. He only did what I had hoped someone would do years ago. He asked for truth to matter. For the first time in many years, I did not feel alone in a room full of familiar faces. I felt my son standing with me. Not in front of me. Not speaking over me. Beside me. And sometimes, after years of being misunderstood, that is the kind of protection a mother needs most. That evening, Daniel asked Vanessa about the rumor. He did not sound angry. He did not raise his voice. He simply placed the medical summary on the table and said, I need to ask you something. Vanessa looked at the folder. What is it? People in the community believe Mom was treated for an addiction to pain medication. For a moment, Vanessa's expression showed surprise. Addiction? Daniel nodded. That's what several people have heard. She slowly shook her head. I never said that. Her voice remained calm. I remember your mom taking pain medication after a procedure years ago. I may have mentioned that she needed rest. I may have said she was recovering. She looked directly at him. But I never told anyone she was addicted. Daniel listened. Months earlier, that answer might have ended the conversation. It sounded reasonable. A medical treatment. A recovery period. People repeating something incorrectly. A misunderstanding that grew larger with time. Vanessa continued. You know how people talk. Someone hears one thing, then repeats it another way. By the time it reaches someone else, the whole story changes. Daniel nodded slowly. That can happen. It probably did. She sighed softly. I never wanted people thinking badly of your mother. Then she added, in the familiar gentle voice he had heard so many times. I only said she needed time to recover. Daniel remained quiet. Vanessa leaned forward. I never said she was addicted to pain medication. He looked down at the medical summary. The records were clear. There was no addiction. No treatment program. No diagnosis. No pattern of misuse. Only a short prescription after surgery, used as directed. Daniel believed the documents. But he also knew something else now. A denial did not answer the entire question. So he asked a different one. If you didn't say it that way. He paused. Then where did everyone hear the same story? Vanessa did not answer immediately. Daniel noticed the silence. He was no longer searching only for whether one person had spoken one sentence. He was looking at the path of the story. How it traveled. Who repeated it. Why so many people believed it. Vanessa finally said, I don't know. Daniel nodded. He did not argue. But this time, he did not accept the explanation as the end of the matter. For years he had stopped at the first reasonable answer. Now he understood that a reasonable answer could still leave important questions unanswered. People did misunderstand. Rumors did change as they traveled. But if many people repeated the same painful story about his mother, then that story had started somewhere. And Daniel knew he needed to find out where. For several days after returning from the community center, I thought about what had happened. Not with anger. Not with resentment. With sadness. The people I had spoken with were not my enemies. Most of them had known me for years. Some had watched Daniel grow up. Others had stood beside Thomas and me at church dinners, neighborhood fundraisers, and holiday gatherings. They were good people. They had simply believed a story that wasn't true. For a long time, I wondered whether I should remain silent. Silence had always felt easier. You avoid uncomfortable conversations. You avoid embarrassing anyone. You hope the misunderstanding will eventually disappear on its own. But I had already learned something during the past year. Silence doesn't always protect the truth. Sometimes it protects the misunderstanding. The following week, our community group met again. I decided I would be there. Not because I wanted to defend myself. Not because I wanted to confront anyone. Because I wanted people to hear directly from me. As I drove to the community center, I quietly repeated one promise to myself. I'm not going there to win. I'm going there to be honest. When I walked through the front door, several people smiled warmly. A few came over to hug me. Others asked how I had been feeling. The kindness in their voices reminded me why I loved this community. They cared. Even when they had been mistaken. The meeting began as it always did. Announcements. Birthdays. Volunteer opportunities. Coffee. Laughter. Nothing unusual. Near the end of the morning, the group leader asked if anyone had anything they'd like to share before everyone went home. For a moment, I remained seated. My heart beat a little faster than usual. Public speaking had never frightened me. But speaking about myself felt different. Then I slowly stood. The room became quiet. Many people smiled at me. Some probably expected me to announce another volunteer project. Instead, I took a slow breath and began. I've heard that many of you have been concerned about my health. Several heads nodded immediately. Their expressions were gentle, supportive. I smiled. Before I say anything else, I want to thank you. A few people looked surprised. I truly appreciate your kindness. I appreciate your prayers. I appreciate that so many of you cared enough to worry about me. The room remained completely silent. No one interrupted. Then I continued. That kind of concern is a beautiful thing. It reminds me how fortunate I am to belong to a community that looks after one another. I paused. Then spoke a little more softly. But I'd also like to clear up something important. I held a folder in my hands. I didn't wave it dramatically. I simply rested it against the podium. I recently requested a summary of my medical records from my physician. I looked around the room. I did that because I heard many different stories about my health. Some people quietly lowered their eyes. Others listened even more closely. My medical records do not contain the things many people have heard. No one moved. No one spoke. I continued calmly. Years ago, after a medical procedure, I was prescribed pain medication for a short period. Like many patients recovering from surgery. It was taken exactly as directed. I smiled gently. My medical record contains no diagnosis of addiction. No treatment for addiction. No rehabilitation program. No medical history that matches the stories many people have heard. The room remained absolutely still. Not because people were angry. Because they were thinking. I looked around the room once more. I didn't come here to argue with anyone. I didn't come to blame anyone. I know rumors often grow without anyone intending harm. Several people slowly nodded. I simply wanted you to hear the truth directly from me. A woman sitting near the front quietly raised her hand. Margaret. Her voice trembled slightly. I'm so sorry. I honestly believed what I'd heard. I smiled. I know. You weren't trying to hurt me. She nodded with tears in her eyes. I never asked whether it was true. Another gentleman spoke. I don't think I ever asked either. Someone else quietly added. I don't even remember where I first heard it. That sentence stayed with me. Not because it answered anything. Because it revealed something important. Rumors often travel farther than memories. People remember the story. They forget the source. For the next several minutes, no one defended the rumor. No one argued. No one tried to explain it away. Instead, something much quieter happened. People reflected. One woman admitted she had repeated the story because she assumed someone closer to me would have known. Another said she had simply accepted it because several people seemed to believe it already. Another confessed she had intended to visit me months earlier but felt embarrassed because she thought I wanted privacy during treatment. Each conversation sounded different. Yet together they revealed the same lesson. Kind people can unintentionally pass along something that isn't true. Not because they enjoy gossip. Because they trust what they've heard. As the meeting came to an end, several friends walked over to speak with me personally. Some apologized. Others hugged me. Many simply thanked me for speaking honestly. I appreciated every conversation. Not because people owed me an apology. Because I could see something changing. The room no longer felt filled with whispered assumptions. It felt filled with thoughtful reflection. As I gathered my folder to leave, I realized something. For months, I had believed restoring my reputation required convincing everyone else. It didn't. It simply required telling my own story. Calmly. Respectfully. Truthfully. As I walked toward the exit, I looked back one last time. Several people were still quietly talking with one another. Not gossiping. Thinking. Reflecting. Wondering. Many of them had begun asking themselves the same question. If they had never verified the story before believing it, how many other stories had they accepted without ever asking whether they were true? Most of the people had already gone home by the time I gathered my folder and put on my coat. The community hall had become quiet again. Someone was stacking chairs near the back wall. The coffee pots were nearly empty. A few volunteers were wiping down the tables. I thought about leaving. I felt lighter than I had when I arrived. For the first time in months, I had spoken for myself instead of wondering what others believed. As I reached for the door, I heard someone softly call my name. Margaret? I turned around. An older woman was walking toward me. I had known her for years. She wasn't one of my closest friends, but we had attended church together, volunteered at community dinners, and shared countless conversations over coffee after Sunday services. She looked nervous. Not frightened. Just uncertain. She stopped a few feet away and folded her hands together. For a moment, she didn't say anything. I smiled gently. It's all right. She looked into my eyes. I think you should know something. I waited quietly. Over the past year, I had learned that people often needed time before saying difficult things. There was no reason to rush her. She took a slow breath. I've been thinking about this ever since you spoke today. I nodded. She continued. When everyone started talking about your health. She hesitated. I remember where I first heard part of the story. I felt my heartbeat slow. Not because I expected a dramatic answer. Because I wanted to understand. Not to argue. Simply to understand. She looked down briefly before speaking again. The first time I heard anything about it. She paused once more. Was from Vanessa. Either of us spoke for a few seconds. The hallway around us remained quiet. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask another question. I simply listened. The woman continued carefully. I want to be fair. She didn't tell me you were addicted. Her voice was firm. I don't remember her using that word. I appreciated her honesty. She wasn't trying to make her memory sound more certain than it was. She was telling me only what she remembered. I remember her saying you were having problems with pain medication. She searched for the exact words. And that the family was very worried about you. I remained silent. She looked uncomfortable. I remember feeling concerned. I thought she was asking people to keep you in their prayers. I nodded gently. I understand. She continued. I never questioned it. I assumed she knew what she was talking about. Again I nodded. That assumption made sense. Most people naturally trust information that appears to come from someone close to the family. The woman sighed softly. Then I mentioned it to another friend. I didn't add anything. I simply repeated what I thought I'd heard. She looked genuinely saddened. But after that, she shook her head. The story seemed to grow. I listened carefully. Someone said they thought you had entered treatment. Someone else believed you'd been gone for months because of it. Another person said Daniel had taken over caring for you. She looked at me with regret. I honestly don't know who added those details. She paused again. But every time the story was repeated, she slowly spread her hands apart. It became a little bigger. I looked at her quietly. Then she spoke the sentence that stayed with me long after we left the community center. Eventually, people simply believed you were addicted. Either of us spoke for several moments. There wasn't much to say. The hallway felt strangely peaceful. No raised voices. No accusations. Only two women standing together, trying to understand how a story had changed over time. Finally, I smiled gently. Thank you for telling me. She looked surprised. You're not angry? I slowly shook my head. No. She looked relieved. I was afraid you might be. I reached over and lightly touched her hand. You told me what you remembered. You didn't pretend to know more than you did. She nodded quietly. I wish I had asked you myself. So do I. For a brief moment, we both smiled. Then I said something I had only recently begun to understand myself. Rumors rarely become powerful because of one conversation. She looked at me. They become powerful because many people repeat them. She lowered her eyes. I think that's what happened. I think so too. As Daniel and I walked toward the parking lot a few minutes later, I told him about the conversation. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he remained thoughtful. So, he spoke slowly. According to what she remembers, the first version wasn't the same as the last one. I nodded. That's how stories sometimes change. He looked across the parking lot for a long moment. One person remembers concern. The next person repeats concern. Someone else fills in details. And eventually, he stopped speaking. I quietly finished the thought. People begin believing a story that no one originally intended to tell. Daniel nodded. Neither of us claimed to know every step that had occurred. We couldn't. The woman had shared only her own recollection, and memories are not perfect. But her conversation offered something we had not heard before. Not proof of every rumor. Not a complete explanation. Just one person's honest memory of where she believed she first heard part of the story. As we drove home, I looked out the window and thought about everyone I had spoken with that morning. Kind people. Compassionate people. People who had sincerely wanted the best for me. None of them had set out to damage my reputation. Yet somewhere between concern and repetition, the story had slowly become something else. And perhaps that was the hardest lesson of all. A rumor doesn't always grow because someone invents a lie. Sometimes it grows because each person unknowingly adds one small piece before passing it to the next. By the time it reaches the end, almost no one remembers where it truly began. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Daniel remained alone in his home office. The room was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. His desk was covered with the same folders that had followed our family through every discovery of the past several months. The insurance records. The bank statements. The storage unit documents. The charity foundation files. The medical summary. Notes from conversations at the community center. Each folder represented a different chapter. Each chapter had begun with confusion. Each one had eventually led to documents. Daniel slowly opened his notebook. It had become more than a place to write observations. It had become a record of how his own understanding had changed. He turned back to the first pages. The handwriting looked different then. Short notes. Questions. Assumptions. Pages filled with uncertainty. As he continued reading, the entries gradually changed. Dates replaced guesses. Timelines replaced memories. Documents replaced rumors. He paused for a long moment, then picked up his pen. On a clean page, he wrote 2 sentences. Rumors don't need evidence to begin. He stopped. Read the sentence once. Then continued. But ending them often requires far more evidence than starting them ever did. He rested the pen on the notebook. Those words were not written out of bitterness. They were written from experience. He thought about everything that had happened since Season 2 began. One letter. One charity record. One medical summary. One conversation after another. The truth had never arrived all at once. It had appeared piece by piece. Each document answered one question while uncovering another. Daniel quietly closed the notebook. For several minutes, he simply sat there looking at the wooden box resting on the corner of his desk. Months earlier, he had believed that evidence existed only for courtrooms. Now he understood something different. Evidence also protects memories. It protects ordinary people. It protects the truth when stories begin changing over time. Just then, his cell phone vibrated across the desk. The screen displayed our attorney's name. Daniel answered immediately. "Good evening." The attorney's voice sounded calm, but quieter than usual. "I've just received another response." Daniel reached for his notebook again. "What is it?" "This one came from the probate records office." Daniel sat a little straighter. "The probate office?" "Yes. There are records concerning your mother's estate planning history." Daniel picked up his pen. "I'm listening." The attorney paused briefly before continuing. "There appear to have been 3 separate appointments scheduled to review or amend your mother's will." Daniel looked toward me across the room. I had been reading quietly in the living room nearby. His expression immediately caught my attention. Then the attorney added something that changed the atmosphere completely. "Each of those appointments was cancelled." Daniel wrote the dates as the attorney read them aloud. 3 appointments. Different months. Different dates. All cancelled. He looked back at the notes. "Do the records say why?" "Not in the material I've received so far." Daniel nodded slowly. Then asked the question that immediately came to mind. "Did my mother attend any of those meetings?" The attorney's answer came without hesitation. "According to the records available to us." He paused. "She did not appear for any of them." The room became completely still. Daniel slowly lowered his pen. He turned toward me. I could see from his face that something unexpected had happened. "What is it?" I asked softly. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he repeated the attorney's words. "There were 3 appointments to change your will." I frowned. "My will?" He nodded. 3 different appointments." I searched my memory. Appointments. Letters. Phone calls. Calendar entries. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I slowly shook my head. "I didn't know about any appointments." Daniel remained silent. Then quietly asked the question anyway. "Mom, do you remember scheduling them?" I looked directly at him. "No." "Do you remember canceling them?" Again. "No." I felt a chill run through me. Not because I feared what the answer might be. Because I had never even known those meetings existed. The attorney spoke once more through the phone. "We'll request the remaining records. We need to determine exactly what documentation exists." Daniel thanked him, then ended the call. For several moments neither of us spoke. The notebook remained open on the desk. Beside it lay the sentence Daniel had written only minutes earlier. "Rumors don't need evidence to begin. But ending them often requires far more evidence than starting them ever did." Now another question had quietly joined the investigation. Not about insurance. Not about donations. Not about medical rumors. About something even more personal. 3 appointments involving my will. 3 appointments I never remembered making. 3 appointments I never attended. Daniel slowly closed the notebook. Then looked at me. Neither of us had an explanation. Only another carefully documented question waiting to be answered. And somewhere inside the probate records, another piece of our family's story was waiting to be found.